So the next thing to consider is what those addresses look like. I mentioned IP addresses, and IP addresses come in the form typically of small numbers separated by dots, maybe 27.45.13.128. I don't know what that address is, I just made it up, but at least is the valid form for an IP address. It's kind of ugly. It'd be really hard to remember, and thank goodness we don't have to remember things like that. Instead, we use what we all know of as URLs. A URL looks more like this: http://www.umd.edu, and then sometimes slash and something else like ~Bederson. So this is a URL, and it's important that we understand what this means. A URL has several core components. The first component is what's called the protocol. There are actually several protocols that you can use on top of TCP/IP. I mentioned, right, that TCP/IP is the very low-level pure communications protocol. On top of that, for the web, we often use HTTP, but it's not the only one, and I bet it's not the only one you know. FTP is another protocol. Then there is the access to the specification of what computer we're accessing. So you can think of this whole part here as the computer. Which computer we're going to access using that protocol. The computer itself consists of a few things. The last two parts are what's called the domain. Right? The University of Maryland owns umd.edu, and this is saying that everything in this domain is part of the University of Maryland. And then over here is the actual computer name. Literally, this is the name of a computer on the domain of umd.edu. Then finally, once you get to that particular computer on that domain, then you can say which file do you want. And this is a specification of a particular file. It's actually a slightly broader than that, but you can think of it as this. So this is saying go to essentially the home, get the main file in this home directory ~Bederson. Oftentimes you'll see a very specific file ending in .html. If it doesn't end in a particular file extension, then it's typically saying give me the main file or the home file in that directory. Now, the computer plus the domain is really important, because the domain could be something like, right, NYT.com, right, New York Times, Google.com, right? These are all organizations that own the domain. And then the thing in front, which you often see as www, is really a computer. And the computer in that domain has to map somehow to an IP address, because it turns out TCP/IP doesn't really know about these addresses, these URLs. What it knows about is those IP addresses. So there is a service called DNS, Domain Name Service, that translates domains, computers and domains, into IP addresses. And there are actually readily available services that freely do this. In fact, they're built all over the place on the internet, because every computer on the internet needs this. Now that you've seen how you can translate a domain into an IP address, we can now see how the entire thing works. Right? We've got a protocol. The domain and computer get translated into an IP address, and we can access a particular file. The last thing that you need to know is that a computer can actually respond to multiple kinds of requests. And it responds to those requests on what are called ports. A computer can have many ports open. They're specified by a number, and each protocol has typically a default port, but you can actually access a protocol on different ports. HTTP by default is accessed on port 80. This is relevant because you can actually change what port you're asking for service on by adding one extra part to the domain. If we asked for www.umd.edu:80, then this right here is the optional port. And if you don't specify the port, then you get the default one, which, as I mentioned, for the web is 80. All right, let's look at one more thing, and that is what happens if you see something like this: www.cs.umd.edu. Right, there's an extra thing here. What does this mean? Well, this is, right, the domain, umd.edu. This, reading from right to left, is the computer. And this over here is what's called a subdomain, which tells the computer science computer named CS that it should redirect all particular requests to this www subdomain, which can be configured to go to yet another computer. And you can have multiple subdomains, right? We actually have something called hcil.cs.umd.edu. And so what happens is these requests get sent to CS. CS looks at its configuration to say that there's a subdomain called HCIL, and in this particular case, we've actually configured it so HCIL subdomain requests get sent to yet another computer that will then respond.